Hi, I'm Sarrah Vesselov, design manager at Honeycomb. I've been working in the design and engineering fields for the past 15 years. A lot of that time has been working in the area of accessibility, both on the design and the front-end engineering side. So I want to talk a little bit today about how you can build culture of accessibility within your design teams and within your company. So I'm going to start by telling you a little story that I promise is relevant and we'll tie back into how you can break through some of the myths and get to the realities of how to build a culture of accessibility at your company. One of my favorite fantasy book series is the Incarnations of Immortality series by Piers Anthony. The books each focus on one of 8 supernatural offices: death, time, fate, war, nature, evil, good, and night, in a fictional reality and history parallel to ours, with the exception that society has advanced both magic and modern technologies. The series covers the adventures and struggles of a group of humans called the Incarnations, who hold these supernatural offices for a certain time. I know, why am I telling you this? Bear with me. Anyway, in one of the books, a character, I think it's Death, I'd have to go back and look, but he goes to visit Kronos. And in order to visit Kronos, they must traverse a water obstacle course of sorts, right? And they have all of these things to choose from. They can choose a plane, a water ski, I think there's a boat. And this character chooses one and begins a harrowing journey where they are almost run over, crashed into, plane almost takes them out. And it's just all by people who just aren't paying any attention to what's going on. And when the character finally arrives to meet Kronos, they angrily complain about all the people along the way that nearly killed them. And Kronos informs them that they were the only person on the obstacle course. The only person getting in their way was themselves. Let's face it, when it comes to accessibility, so often we get in our own way. We're under constant pressure to design, build, and ship. In order to meet these demands, we cut scope, and we promise to ourselves and others that we will take care of tech and UX debt in the next iteration. But what happens when that iteration doesn't happen, or gets pushed off by competing priorities? When does accessibility become the priority? This is where the idea of an entire sprint devoted to accessibility, tech, or UX debt comes from, right? If we can't make space in our regular cycles, then we'll need to tackle it as a special project, right? Right? Accessibility isn't a place to cut scope, and it isn't a special project. I'm here to argue that accessibility should be approached as table stakes for any product you're working on. In business, table stakes represents the minimum requirement you need to have to maintain a credible competitive position. This applies to accessibility as much as anything else. By viewing accessibility as special, extra, and difficult, we're inadvertently getting in our own way of making our products better. I want to start by deconstructing some of the myths I hear quite regularly about accessibility. These myths make accessibility seem difficult, and they don't reflect reality. Afterwards, we'll discuss how you can build a culture of accessibility among your teams. So the first myth that I want to talk about is that accessibility makes it hard to implement good design. I've heard this from designers and engineers alike. And my gut tells me this comes from the early days of the web, which I am definitely old enough to remember, when technology was not advanced enough to allow anything but text-only websites to be accessible. This certainly is no longer the case. WCAG or WCAG guidelines don't restrict the use of decorative images and elements, but they do ask you to make them accessible for all who use your site and product. The reality here is that accessibility is anything but boring and will enhance the usability of your site or product. We'll learn more about that in the next one. This next myth is that accessibility only helps a small number of people. While it's true that 54% of adults living with a disability use the internet, compared with 81% of adults without disabilities, according to a 2017 Pew Research study, that isn't really the full picture. The figures reported on adoption and internet use are from phone surveys that were conducted via landline and cell phones. So this likely undercovered adults who were deaf or have difficulty speaking. In addition, the estimates reported here are from panel surveys conducted via the web and mail, which may underrepresent blind people. Add that to the millions of people affected by temporary disabilities or who are getting older and beginning to feel the effects of hearing, sight, and dexterity issues, the number of users affected by some form of disability is likely much higher. The reality is, from cleaner, clearer layouts and headings to better keyboard navigation, it becomes obvious fairly quickly that accessibility benefits everyone. This next myth is really pervasive. Accessibility is expensive, time-consuming, and really hard to do. I'm convinced that this comes from a lack of understanding of good accessibility practices. There are no special skills or technologies required to make your designs and products accessible. What can be time-consuming and expensive is rebuilding, refactoring, or redesigning an inaccessible product. The reality is that accessibility done right is inexpensive and takes little extra time. Understand what your accessibility goals are and share them with your company and team. Talk about them. When you begin with the end in mind, the decisions and resources you'll need along the way become very clear. This can even be done when refactoring and redesigning. Take it in small pieces and be okay with rolling out improvements over time rather than feeling this pressure to make large changes all at once. We did this recently at Honeycomb, rolling out color changes in a series of waves, slowly improving our color contrast over a series of releases. Another myth is that accessibility is someone else's problem. Tell me if you've heard any of these. The designs I got didn't have enough contrast. They aren't accessible. The developer didn't add area labels. It just isn't accessible. The product manager told us we didn't have time, so we had to cut scope. That's why it isn't accessible. The reality is, accessibility is everyone's problem. We all share in the responsibility of making it a priority and doing our part to make sure that the features and projects that we touch are usable by everyone. The last myth I want to talk about is that accessibility is a choice. By cutting scope and pushing off improvements that make our products accessible, we're saying that we have a choice as to whether or not to make our products accessible for all people. We're ignoring the fact that entire countries require website accessibility, and even those that don't have seen successful litigation for lack of web accessibility. The reality is that accessibility can be a choice we make every day. We can build it into the foundations of our work and choose to make it a principle into how we build our products. One of the ways that you can build a culture of accessibility is to make accessibility foundational. A big part of what I do as a design manager is to build consensus and drive work. At Honeycomb, we've made accessibility one of our design principles. That means that accessibility is a consideration in everything we design.
Accessibility is the first principle you see when you visit the Design Principles page in our design system, Lattice. We assert that accessibility is a right, not a privilege, and we strive to keep it in the front of our minds as we design and solve problems for our users. You can see that we've even added a few prompt questions to get people thinking about how this principle may relate to their work. It's not enough just to assert that accessibility is a right, not a privilege, and you should think about it. We want to get people thinking about how to actually take this thing and this idea and this principle and apply it to the work that they're doing, right? So we focused on the aspects of accessibility here that don't necessarily first jump to your mind. So things like, are we emphasizing recognition over recall? How are we using proximity to show relationships? Are we considering the impact of color, size, and typography choices and thinking about the overall layout and how we can make it easier for every one of our users to go through these layouts and understand what's happening on the page? Simple things that make it easier for everybody, but also especially help users with accessibility issues.
For instance, recently working on our dropdowns, one of the things that we wanted to make sure of was that our tab and keyboard navigation worked well. So that was one of the things that we made sure of from the get-go, was that users were able to tab through and navigate using just keyboard navigation in that component as part of that design. This carries over into our design system, Lattice. We have an entire section dedicated to accessibility, and each component has a section for accessibility that you should be thinking about as you use that component and as you design. For instance, the dropdown, there's an entire section there about the tab navigation that was added to that component and the ways that you should be thinking about it when you use that component within our product.
When building your culture around accessibility, I always tell people to get specific where necessary in terms of your accessibility levels. So at Honeycomb, we strive to meet WCAG or WCAG AA standards. And the best way, or the best example I could find of this in our standards to show you would be around colors. I think this is the area where most people are either adhering to AA. AAA is really hard when it comes to some of these ratios. So AA is what you'll see most companies and products adhering to. But this is an example of our color guidelines within our design system, Lattice. And you'll notice that we actually educate as we are laying out these guidelines here. So you'll see we have a definition of what it means to be AA, and what it means to be AAA in terms of contrast ratio, and we even specify it out for user interface components versus input borders, etc. And I think this is really important. You shouldn't assume that everybody is coming from the same base level understanding of different accessibility standards and what is a pass, what is a fail. It's very important to make sure that you are educating people and helping everyone to level up and understand what that baseline is as they onboard and as they start reading through those documentations and guidelines. And these links here actually will take them to the documentation so that they can read more about it if they're not sure. In addition, and I'll scroll down here a little bit, and this is a really long page. I'll scroll down here in a minute and show you just how long it gets. But you probably have seen some of this. I'm sorry, I keep highlighting this whole page, but you may have seen some of this in other systems and wondered what it was, or perhaps you know what it is, but you'll notice these little check marks. One is in black and one is in white, and you'll see graphical objects and user interface components. This is actually telling you whether or not this is a pass or a fail for graphical objects and user interface components at the AA level. So if it's a pass or a fail, you'll actually see it. If it's a pass, you'll see it. If it's a fail, you won't see it. And you'll even see it says the presence of the accessibility rating denotes the minimum contrast ratio has been met for the corresponding color combination. So what this means is that anything that is dark colored or is light colored will pass the graphical objects and user interface components accessibility on this background. And that goes the same over here for your normal text, your large text. What you'll notice here is that there is not a AAA rating for the large. It does not meet those accessibility guidelines. It just meets the AA for a couple of these. And if you scroll down, you notice that we've done this for every single one of our colors. And there are a lot less than we used to have. We did do a lot of cleanup work over time here. But this is a really helpful tool when deciding on new color combinations and designs. We've kind of done a lot of the work for a design ahead of time in the future to understand whether or not new combinations will be accessible. Our accessibility guidelines are grounded in the 4 principles of web content accessibility. There are 4 overarching ideals for everything we design and build. So that is laid out here as the first thing that you see. And these are based on the web content accessibility guidelines. And we actually give a link here for anyone visiting to see the full description of what these are and what they entail. But we like to give a little summary so that everybody can have a sense of what this means and what we should be thinking about as we run through and actually do these designs. And then we start laying out the basics for layout and communication, keyboard navigation, focus, tooltips, what it means to be accessible in our communication, all the way down into images, video, colors, of course, which we just saw, and then into how we test and research. And I do call out here that there are additional guidelines under every component. So if you go back up, you'll notice on the left-hand side, like many design systems, We cover a lot of foundational elements, but then we have these individual components. And under each component, there'll be accessibility guidelines that are specific to that component, things that you should be thinking about when you're designing for that, as well as when you're implementing that from an engineering side. So you'll see here under our checkbox component, when we go down at the bottom, we make a point of mentioning that a group of checkboxes should be marked up using fields and legend elements. So this is where design and engineering start coming together, making sure that accessibility remains a focus even as we hand designs off to be implemented. And again, this all revolves around this culture of accessibility. We're thinking about it from the start of the design. We're thinking about it as we implement it. We're thinking about it as we send other members of our team to these guidelines when they have questions. So it's part of our discussions in our everyday, and it's something that is part of our checklists, you know, when we go through at the end and decide whether or not things have been implemented as we had hoped that they would be. So it's a big part of our everyday process at Honeycomb.
And this goes for engineering as well, who put together their own accessibility best practices guide. So this is used by all of the engineers as they're building out new components and new designs. They reference this guide to make sure that they are incorporating our best practices for accessibility as we build out new pieces of the product. And add it to your checklist as you would any other table stakes acceptance criteria. Don't rely on memory alone. Make it part of your acceptance criteria that new features and components meet accessibility requirements. If it doesn't pass, it doesn't ship. It's also good practice to check for accessibility as you bug fix and work through other things in the product. Just see what's out there. If you don't have time to fix accessibility issues, catalog them, backlog them, and make sure that you know that they're there for future fixes. Stop thinking in terms of color. For some reason, when I say accessibility, the first thing people want to talk about is designing for colorblind users. That's great, but there's so much more to accessibility. Better layout and hierarchy, improving keyboard and tab navigation. It's ensuring that interactive elements have defined states and that non-decorative elements, images have alt text. There's so much more than just worrying about colorblind users. You need to expand your idea of what accessibility is and how many users it actually touches. Don't rely on automated tools. Meet with real users. Using a plugin or a screen reader is great as one step in the process. You must get your product in the hands of real users with real challenges to know whether or not you succeeded in making your products accessible. Build diverse teams. Talking with users is great, and it's even better to have a diverse team made up of the very people that need your product to be more accessible. By approaching accessibility as table stakes and breaking the work down into small, doable pieces, it stops feeling so difficult and time-consuming, even when you are refactoring pieces and parts of existing designs and architecture. We can start to see accessibility as simply part of our everyday work as a designer, a developer, or a product manager, and stop getting in our and our users' way. Thank you so much for attending today. I hope you got something out of my talk. You learned a little bit more about accessibility than you knew before, and I look forward to answering your questions.